By the spring of 1453, the city of Constantinople was already a ghost story. It was a capital that had outlived its empire, a sprawling, decaying monument to a Roman glory that had long since evaporated. For over 1,100 years, it had stood as the majestic gateway between Europe and Asia, the golden center of Christendom in the east. But the city that awaited the dawn of April was a shadow. Where once 500,000 souls had crowded its bustling avenues, perhaps fewer than 50,000 remained. They lived in separated clusters, small villages huddled around ancient churches, separated by broad stretches of abandoned ruins and vegetable gardens, all hidden behind the deceptive might of its legendary walls. The silence in the streets was profound. The great wealth that had once drawn merchants from the furthest corners of the known world was gone, stripped away by centuries of civil war, foreign looting, and economic strangulation. The imperial palaces of Byzantine were drafty and ill-maintained. The gold had turned to copper, the jewels had turned to glass. The people who remained were defined by a deep, ancestral melancholy. They were the custodians of a magnificent corpse, walking daily past the monuments of emperors whose power rivaled the gods, knowing in their hearts that they were the last generation. Geopolitically, the noose had already closed. The empire of the Romans now consisted of little more than the city itself and a few scattered, powerless possessions in Greece. They were an island in an expanding Ottoman sea. For decades, the sultans had bypassed the impregnable capital, absorbing everything around it, crossing into Europe and conquering the Balkans. Constantinople was no longer a strategic player. It was merely an obstacle, a stubborn remnant of an old world order that refused to die. The Christian kingdoms of the West, divided by their own squabbles and separated by a deep religious schism with the Orthodox East, offered little more than sympathy and empty promises. Sitting upon this precarious throne was Constantine XI Palaiologos. He was a man of immense personal integrity and courage, a capable soldier who had spent his life fighting losing battles in the provinces. He was 54 years old, a widower twice over and childless. History had dealt him the cruelest of hands, the responsibility of presiding over an inevitable funeral. He did not possess the resources to save his city, yet his duty forbade him from surrendering it. He ruled with a quiet dignity, fully aware that he was likely destined to be the last Roman emperor. Facing him, just outside the city's horizon, was a force of nature. Sultan Mehmed II was only 21 years old. He was brilliant, multilingual, secretive, and fiercely ambitious. Having taken the throne for the second time after a turbulent youth, he was determined to prove himself to his skeptical generals and to fulfill an ancient Islamic prophecy that a great commander would one day unlock the city of Constantinople for the faith. To Mehmed, the city was not just a strategic prize. It was the ultimate symbol of universal sovereignty. It was the red apple, the heart of the world, and he intended to cut it out. Throughout the winter of 1452, the intelligence reaching Constantine became increasingly terrifying. The young sultan was not just posturing. He was mobilizing the entire resources of his burgeoning empire. From Anatolia and the Balkans, levies were called up. Thousands of irregular troops, motivated by the promise of plunder, began to drift toward the Bosporus. It was an assembly on a scale not seen since the heights of antiquity. The roads groaned under the weight of carts and supplies. The intent was undeniable. This was not a raid to extract tribute. This was a war of extermination. Inside the city, the atmosphere shifted from denial to dread. The emperor did what little he could. He sent desperate embassies to the Pope in Rome and the maritime republics of Venice and Genoa, begging for aid that would largely never arrive. He ordered the precious few reserves of grain to be rationed. Citizens, monks, and nuns were conscripted to clear the neglected moats and patch the crumbling masonry of the walls. They worked with a desperate, quiet energy, praying as they mortared stones that had stood for 1,000 years, hoping their ancient sanctity would be enough. But Mehmed was not relying on manpower alone. He was a student of history and military science, and he understood that the age of stone fortifications was drawing to a close. He embraced the terrifying new technology of gunpowder with an almost obsessive zeal. Throughout the winter, in his foundry at Adrianople, furnaces burned day and night. He had hired engineers from across Europe, paying them fortunes to build him engines of destruction that the world had never seen. The centerpiece of this new arsenal was a horror constructed by a Hungarian master founder named Urban. It was a cannon of staggering proportions, a bronze monster 27 feet long, capable of hurling a 1,200-pound stone ball over a mile. It was so heavy, it required 60 oxen and 400 men just to move it. Its existence changed the fundamental mathematics of the siege. The Theodosian walls, the triple-layered defense system that had shattered every army that had ever marched against it, had never faced a weapon that could punch through solid rock like a fist through parchment. As March turned to April in 1453, the vanguard of the Ottoman army crested the hills to the west of the city. The residents of Constantinople climbed to their roofs and battlements to watch their doom arrive. It began as a trickle of cavalry, then became a flood of infantry, engineers, and miners. A city of tents, larger and more populous than the ancient capital itself, rose from the fields almost overnight. Constantine XI stood on the walls and looked out at a force that outnumbered his own garrison by perhaps 10 or 15 to 1. He had less than 7,000 trained soldiers to defend 12 miles of walls. The sheer mathematics of the situation were crushing. There was no hope of victory in open battle. Their only strategy was endurance. To hold the walls until the Sultan's army ran out of food, patience, or money. On April 6th, the Sultan formally laid siege to the city. The preliminary silence was not broken by the shouts of men, but by a deafening roar that shook the foundations of the Hagia Sophia miles away. The great cannons had arrived. As the first massive stone shot slammed into the ancient masonry, sending dust and shards flying into the spring air, the people of Constantinople realized that the long twilight of their empire was over. The night had truly begun. To understand the horror of the siege, one must first understand the obstacle. For 1,000 years, the Theodosian walls were the supreme achievement of military engineering. Stretching 4 miles across the landward neck of the peninsula, they were not a single barrier, but a killing machine designed in depth. An attacking army first had to cross a 60-foot wide moat, then scale an outer wall, and finally face the inner wall, a 40-foot high curtain of limestone and brick, studded with 96 massive towers. They were designed to withstand catapults, battering rams, and the erosion of time. But they were not designed for the fury of the 15th century. The Ottoman bombardment that began in April 1453 was the first instance in history of concentrated artillery fire used to dismantle a city. This was not a random lobbing of stones. It was an industrial process. Mehmed had organized his batteries into groups, targeting the most vulnerable sections of the wall, particularly the valley of the Lycus, where the defenses dipped down into a riverbed. The great cannon, the basilica, was so difficult to cool and load that it could only be fired 7 times a day. But the psychological impact was constant. When the great ball struck, the ground shook for miles. The impact did not just crack the stone, it pulverized it. The ancient mortar, which had held firm against Goths, Huns, and Avars, disintegrated into blinding clouds of choking white dust. For the defenders watching from the ramparts, the experience was apocalyptic. They were witnessing the physical destruction of their history, watching the shield of Christendom being eaten away, yard by yard, by a force they could barely comprehend. Yet, amidst the dust and panic, a figure emerged who brought order to the chaos. Giovanni Giustiniani Longo was a Genoese nobleman, a professional soldier of fortune who had arrived with 700 men just months before the siege. He was an expert in the defense of fortified places. While Constantine was the soul of the city, Giustiniani became its sword. Recognizing the emperor's lack of military experience, Constantine effectively handed operational command of the land walls to the Genoese captain. It was a move that likely saved the city from falling in the first week. The garrison Giustiniani commanded was a study in tragic cosmopolitanism. Of the 7,000 defenders, nearly a third were foreigners: Venetians, Genoese, Catalans, and even a contingent of Ottoman Turks led by a rebel prince, all fighting for their own reasons. They were vastly outnumbered, stretched thin along the perimeter. A single man often had to guard a stretch of wall that required 10. But under Giustiniani's charismatic leadership, they fought with a unified, desperate discipline. The war quickly settled into a grueling rhythm. What the Ottoman cannons destroyed by day, the people of Constantinople rebuilt by night. As the stone towers crumbled, Giustiniani realized that rigid masonry was a liability against cannon fire. It was too brittle. He ordered the defenders to stop trying to rebuild the stone walls. Instead, they constructed stockades from earth, timber, and barrels of wool. This improvisation was a stroke of genius. When the cannonballs struck the soft earthworks, the force was absorbed rather than reflected. The spongy barriers held up better than the ancient limestone. The defenders worked in darkness, listening to the Ottoman camp asleep just a few hundred yards away, hauling earth until their hands bled, knowing that sunrise would bring the bombardment once again. It was a contest of engineering speed. Could the Sultan destroy the walls faster than the emperor's people could patch them? Frustrated by the resilience of the defense, Mehmed ordered the first infantry assaults. These were not the elite troops, but the irregulars, cannon fodder sent to tire out the defenders. They surged toward the moat with ladders and grappling hooks, screaming to intimidate the Christians. But the walls, though damaged, were still formidable. The fighting at the breaches was savage. The Byzantines and Italians, fighting back to back, utilized their elevation to devastating effect. They rained down arrows, stones, and Greek fire, a liquid incendiary that clung to flesh and could not be extinguished with water. Giustiniani seemed to be everywhere at once, rallying wavering troops, plugging gaps in the line, and proving to the Sultan that the city would not be taken by mere intimidation. By the end of April, the initial Ottoman optimism had soured. The great walls were battered, scarred, and breached in dozens of places, but they were unbroken. The moat was choked with the bodies of the Sultan's infantry, yet the flag of the Palaiologos still flew. The defenders had won the first round. They had proven that gunpowder alone could not conquer Constantinople. It would require blood. But Mehmed was not a man to be deterred by initial failure. He realized that a frontal assault on the land walls was becoming a stalemate. If he could not break through the front door, he would have to find a way to open a window. His eyes turned away from the bloody valley of the Lycus and toward the water to the Golden Horn, the city's secure harbor where the defenders believed they were safe. As night fell on the closing days of April, the defenders slumped against the earthworks, too exhausted to cheer their survival. They had held the line, but at a terrible cost of energy and supplies. They were winning the battle for the walls, but they were slowly losing the war for survival. And in the silence of the sea, a new threat was preparing to strangle the last hope of the city. To the south lay the Sea of Marmara. To the west, the land walls. But to the north lay the Golden Horn, a calm, sieve-shaped inlet that formed the city's primary harbor. For centuries, this body of water had been the city's Achilles heel. The seaward walls along the Horn were lower and thinner than the land walls, designed only to prevent amphibious landings, not to withstand a sustained siege. The Byzantines knew this weakness well. To protect it, they relied on a massive iron chain. A boom stretched across the harbor mouth, from the city to the Genoese colony of Galata on the opposite shore. This chain was not a metaphor. It was a colossal piece of engineering. Each link was the size of a man's torso. As long as the chain held, the Ottoman navy was locked out of the harbor. The defenders could leave the northern walls virtually unmanned, focusing their scarce manpower on the battered land walls. Mehmed knew that as long as the harbor remained a sanctuary for Byzantine ships, The city could be resupplied by sea, and his siege might fail. He had to break the chain. Early in the siege, the importance of the sea was violently demonstrated. 3 Genoese ships and 1 imperial transport, laden with grain and soldiers from the Pope, appeared on the horizon. The Ottoman fleet, numbering over 100 vessels, swarmed out to intercept them. Mehmed rode his horse into the surf, screaming commands, expecting an easy victory. But the Christian ships were taller, sturdier, and commanded by veteran sailors. They smashed through the Ottoman galleys, raining down Greek fire and arrows, and miraculously slipped past the chain into the safety of the Horn. The humiliation was unbearable for the young Sultan. His massive fleet had been humiliated by 4 ships. He realized that the chain would never be broken by force. The Genoese in Galata were neutral but sympathetic to the city, and the currents were treacherous. If he could not sail through the chain, he would have to go around it. But around it lay the steep forested hills of Pera. It was physically impossible to sail a ship over a mountain. Or so it seemed. What followed was one of the most audacious feats in military history. Mehmed ordered the construction of a slipway, a road of greased logs stretching over the hill behind the neutral colony of Galata. While his cannons bombarded the chain to distract the defenders, thousands of laborers worked in secret. They leveled the forest floor, laid the timber track, and prepared teams of oxen. The plan was madness: to drag his fleet out of the water, up the steep slope, over the ridge, and down into the Golden Horn behind the chain. On the night of April 21st, the operation began. It was a scene from a fever dream. Dozens of ships were winched out of the Bosphorus. With sails hoisted to catch the night breeze and teams of oxen pulling at the ropes, the vessels began their ascent. Drums beat a rhythm to coordinate the pulling. The ships creaked and groaned as they moved over the greased logs, inching their way up the hillside, invisible to the defenders inside the city. The morning of April 22nd brought a cold shock to the defenders. As the mist cleared over the Golden Horn, the Byzantines looked out and saw the impossible. There, sitting calmly in the waters of the harbor waters that had been safe for centuries, was an Ottoman fleet of 70 ships. The chain was intact, but it was now useless. The enemy was inside the gates. The strategic consequences were catastrophic. The psychological blow was even worse. The safe flank was gone. Constantine was forced to pull precious troops from the land walls, where they were already outnumbered 10-1, and sent them to guard the miles of sea walls along the harbor. The thin blue line of defenders became even thinner. The encirclement was now total. There was no way in and no way out. Panic began to set in, but the Venetians in the harbor refused to give up. They proposed a daring counterstrike, a night attack with fireships to burn the Ottoman fleet before it could fully deploy. It was a sound plan, but it required secrecy and speed. Tragically, the city was leaking information like a sieve. Delays, arguments over command, and Genoese hesitation pushed the attack back by days. When the attack finally launched on April 28th, the Ottomans were waiting. Mehmed's spies had alerted him. As the Venetian ships approached, the Ottoman batteries on the shore opened fire with devastating accuracy. The surprise attack turned into a massacre. Ships exploded, lighting up the dark waters of the Horn. Sailors who swam to shore were captured and beheaded in full view of the city walls. The failure of the relief attack broke the spirit of the sailors. The Golden Horn, once their lifeline, had become a prison. The waters where the Imperial Navy had once ruled were now a death trap. The defenders on the walls looked down at the floating wreckage of their last hope. And for the first time, the whispers of inevitable defeat began to spread through the streets. By the start of May, the food situation was critical. The city was starving. The emperor walked the streets, trying to maintain morale, but his eyes betrayed his exhaustion. He knew the truth. The walls were crumbling, the harbor was lost, and the West remained silent. The city was alone. And as the days grew longer, the shadows over Constantinople grew darker. The Golden Horn had been the key to the city's survival. Now, it was the open door through which its destruction would enter. The siege had shifted from a battle of walls to a battle of will. And in the dark corners of the city, people began to look for signs, not from the emperor, but from God. They looked to the sky, fearing what they might see. The stage was set for the final act. The defenses were breached, the harbor was taken, and the defenders were exhausted. All that remained was faith. But even faith was about to be tested as the heavens themselves seemed to turn against the last Romans. May arrived with a suffocating heaviness. The bombardment had been relentless for weeks. The walls were a patchwork of rubble and timber stockades. Inside the city, the gnawing pain of hunger was replaced by a hollow, listless dread. The defenders were not just fighting the Ottomans. They were fighting the creeping realization that their time had run out. And in a city as deeply religious as Constantinople, where every stone was steeped in theology, the people did not look to military maps for answers. They looked to the heavens. There were ancient prophecies that haunted the streets. One whispered that the city would never fall as long as the moon was waxing. Another, darker legend claimed that the empire would end as it had begun, established by a Constantine, son of Helena, and lost by a Constantine, son of Helena. Constantine XI, whose mother was indeed named Helena, bore this weight in silence. He knew his people were searching for omens, and he feared what they would find. On the night of May 24th, the omen appeared. A full moon rose over the Bosphorus, but as the city watched, a shadow began to eat it. It was a lunar eclipse. For 3 hours, the moon turned the color of blood. To the superstitious minds of the 15th century, this was not astronomy. It was a verdict. The Virgin Mary, the city's eternal protector, was withdrawing her favor. The light of the world was going out. Panic spread through the streets like a contagion. Desperate to regain divine favor, a massive procession was organized the next day. The holiest icon of the Virgin was carried through the streets, but the air was heavy and stifling. Suddenly, a violent thunderstorm broke. Hail and rain lashed the city. In the chaos, the heavy icon slipped from the hands of its bearers and fell face down into the mud. When they tried to lift it, it felt impossibly heavy, as if glued to the earth. The screams of the faithful were drowned out by the thunder. To the Byzantines, the message was clear. God had rejected their prayers. Then came the final, most terrifying sign. A strange light was seen engulfing the great dome of the Hagia Sophia. Some saw it as a pillar of fire, others as a strange fog that lifted from the base of the church and drifted up into the heavens. The interpretation was universal and devastating. The Holy Spirit was leaving the city. The spiritual shield that had protected Constantinople for a millennium had evaporated. The city was now naked before its enemies. Sensing the crumbling morale, Sultan Mehmed made one last move. He paused the bombardment. A silence, louder than the cannons, fell over the lines. He sent an envoy to the emperor with a final offer. It was a generous one. Constantine could surrender the city and walk away. He would be given safety, his people would be spared the sack, and he would be allowed to rule a small province in Greece. The alternative was death and slavery for everyone. Constantine's response to the Sultan is one of the most famous declarations in history. He did not speak with the arrogance of a king, but with the resignation of a martyr. He replied, "As to surrendering the city to you, it is not for me to decide or for anyone else of its citizens. For all of us have reached the mutual decision to die of our own free will without any regard for our lives." He was choosing honor over survival. He was choosing to be the tombstone of his empire. When Mehmed received the refusal, he did not rage. He simply nodded. The time for diplomacy was over. On May 27th, he rode through his camp and announced a general assault. By Islamic law, because the city had refused to surrender, the soldiers would be granted 3 days of unrestricted looting. The camp erupted in joy. That night, the Ottomans lit thousands of bonfires. The ring of fire around the city was so bright that inside the walls, the defenders could read letters at midnight. The psychological warfare was intense. The Ottomans chanted, prayed, and beat drums. The noise was a physical wall of sound, designed to deny the defenders sleep and peace. Inside the city, the silence of the grave had already set in. The shops were closed. The churches were full. People said their goodbyes to neighbors they had known all their lives. The illusions were gone. There would be no Venetian fleet on the horizon. There would be no miracle. Strategically, the endgame was clear. The bombardment had concentrated on the section of the walls near the St. Romanus Gate. The moat there had been filled in with debris. The great tower of Byzantine had collapsed. The stockades were battered. This was where the hammer would fall. Justiniani and the emperor spent the final days shoring up this valley of death, placing their best troops in the gap. They knew exactly where they would die. Monday, May 28. The sun rose on the last day of the Roman Empire. The Ottoman camp suddenly went quiet. Mehmed had ordered a day of rest and silence to prepare for the assault. This sudden cessation of noise was more terrifying than the drums. It was the deep breath before the scream. In the city, the bells of the churches began to ring a mournful, slow tolling that echoed over the Golden Horn. As evening fell, the emperor ordered a procession. But this was different. For centuries, the Greeks and the Latins, the Orthodox and the Catholics had been bitterly divided by schism. But on this last night, the theological walls collapsed. Everyone, from the Genoese soldier to the Greek nun, streamed toward the great church of Hagia Sophia. They gathered under the Golden Dome not as partisans, but as Christians facing the dark. The sheer scale of the tragedy had finally united them. They confessed their sins to one another. They embraced. In the face of the apocalypse, the petty differences of doctrine vanished. The emperor attended the service, praying with the intensity of a man who knows he is attending his own funeral. He asked forgiveness from anyone he might have wronged. Then he stood up, turned his back on the altar, and walked out into the cool night air. He mounted his horse and rode toward the walls. The service was over. The sacrifice was about to begin. The night of May 28, 1453, witnessed a scene unique in the history of Christendom. For months, the city had been tearing itself apart over religious differences. The Unionists, who wanted to reunify with the Catholic Church to secure aid, were despised by the hardline Orthodox populace. Better the Turkish turban than the papal tiara, some had said. But death has a way of clarifying priorities. On this final night, the great bronze doors of the Hagia Sophia were thrown open to everyone. There was no protocol. There were no sides. Inside the great church, the atmosphere was thick with incense and the sound of weeping. For the first and last time, Italian sailors stood shoulder to shoulder with Greek monks. Catholic cardinals and Orthodox bishops, who had spent lifetimes condemning each other as heretics, celebrated the liturgy together. They drank from the same chalice. The schism that had divided East and West for 400 years was healed not by a council, but by the looming shadow of the Ottoman sword. It was a unity born of despair, a funeral mass for an empire celebrated by its own survivors. Constantine moved through the crowd like a ghost. He did not wear his crown. He walked among his people, asking for forgiveness from every bishop, every general, and every common citizen he passed. If he had been arrogant, if he had been harsh, if he had failed them, he asked to be absolved. And the people, seeing their emperor reduced to a penitent, wept openly. He took communion, and then, the history books tell us, he stood for a moment looking up into the vast darkness of the dome, perhaps wondering if his prayers were rising past the stone. Leaving the church, Constantine rode to the palace of Blasini for a brief final council. He gathered his commanders Justiniani, the Venetian bailo, the Genoese captains, and his own Greek nobles. The speech he gave them was recorded by those who survived. It was not a speech of tactical instructions. It was a eulogy for the Roman world. He told them that a man should always be ready to die for his faith, his country, his family, or his sovereign. Today, he said, You must be ready to die for all four." He spoke of the city not just as a capital, but as the queen of cities, the refuge of Christians, the hope and joy of all Greeks. He told them that their ancestors were the heroes of ancient Greece and Rome, and that they must not dishonor that lineage. He turned to the Italians and thanked them, calling them brothers and fellow soldiers. He did not promise them victory. He promised them a death worthy of history. "I place my hope in your hands," he said, "and I pray to God that you will earn a crown of martyrdom that will never fade." The commanders embraced one another and rode out to their posts. The gates were locked. The keys were sent back to the emperor. The bridges over the moat were destroyed to prevent retreat. The die was cast. Along the 4 miles of the land walls, the defenders took their stations. They were tired, hungry, and terrified. They peered out into the darkness, where the Ottoman camp lay in a silence that was even more menacing than the noise. Mehmed had also given his orders. He would attack in 3 waves. First, the Bashi Bazauks, the regulars. The expendables would go in to absorb the defenders' arrows and exhaust their energy. Second, the Anatolian army, disciplined professional soldiers, would crack the walls. And finally, when the defenders were broken by fatigue, he would unleash the Janissaries, the Sultan's elite household guard, the finest shock troops in the world, to deliver the death blow. It was a machine designed to grind the garrison into dust. It was now long past midnight. The date changed to Tuesday, May 29th. The air was cool. On the walls, men checked their weapons, tightened their armor straps, and whispered final prayers. In the distance, a dog barked. Then, silence again. The world seemed to hold its breath. At approximately 1:30 in the morning, the silence was shattered. Not by a single shot, but by a roar that sounded like the earth splitting open. Thousands of drums, cymbals, and horns erupted from the Ottoman lines. The darkness was illuminated by muzzle flashes as the Ottoman artillery opened fire all at once. And then came the scream. Tens of thousands of men, shouting the name of God, surged out of the darkness toward the walls. The first wave hit the walls like a tsunami. The Bashi Bazauks had no armor, only ladders and reckless courage. They swarmed into the moat. The defenders, energized by the adrenaline of the moment, met them with a withering hail of stones and bolts. At close range, they could not miss. The moat filled with bodies, but the attackers kept coming, climbing over their own dead to reach the stockades. Giustiniani was magnificent. He moved along the stockade, directing the fire, ensuring no gap went unplugged. For 2 hours, the defenders held. They fought with the fury of men who have accepted death. The Bashi Bazauks were slaughtered by the thousands. Finally, seeing his first wave broken, Mehmed ordered the retreat. A cheer went up from the walls. They had survived the first shock. But there was no time to rest. Before the dust could settle, the second wave was already advancing. These were not irregulars. These were the Anatolian levies, well-armed, well-armored, and disciplined. They did not scream. They marched to the beat of drums. They carried heavier ladders and portable bridges. They focused their attack on the Lycus Valley, where the walls were smashed to rubble. The fighting became hand-to-hand. The long range of the crossbows was useless now. It was sword against scimitar, spear against axe. The bells of the city began to ring again, a frantic clanging alarm summoning every able-bodied male to the walls. The women of Constantinople ran to the ramparts, bringing water and stones, cheering on their husbands and sons. Constantine was in the thick of it, fighting alongside his troops near the St. Romanus Gate. The Anatolians pushed hard. At one point, a breach was made, and a group of Turks forced their way inside. But the emperor and his guard counterattacked, surrounding them and cutting them down. Against all odds, the line held. The Anatolians, like the Bashi Bazauks before them, began to waver. The dawn was approaching. The defenders had been fighting for 4 hours without a break. They were exhausted, dehydrated, and bleeding. They had repelled 2 armies. But as they looked out over the piles of dead in the moat, They saw the one thing they feared most. The Sultan was playing his final card. The Janissaries were moving forward. They came on at a run, keeping perfect formation. They did not shout. A military band played a rhythmic, hypnotic beat. These were the Sultan's own sons, the harvest of the Devshirme, boys taken from Christian families and raised to be the perfect Islamic warriors. They were fresh, rested, and fanatically loyal. They hit the exhausted defenders with the force of a sledgehammer. And then, a tragedy of fate occurred. On the northern flank, a small sally port, called the Carcaporta, a minor gate used for sorties, had been left unlocked. Perhaps by treachery, perhaps by simple human error in the chaos. A group of irregulars noticed the opening. They slipped inside, climbed a tower, and suddenly, the Ottoman flag was flying from the walls behind the defenders. The cry went up, "The city is taken! The city is taken!" Panic is a contagion more lethal than the plague. It rippled down the line, but the defense had not yet collapsed. Giustiniani was still holding the center. The emperor was still fighting. The end was close, but it was not yet certain. Then, a single piece of lead changed history. A bullet, fired from a culverin or perhaps a lucky shot from a handgun, flew through the smoke. It found the one man the city could not afford to lose. It struck Giovanni Giustiniani. Then, a single piece of lead changed history. A bullet, fired from a culverin or perhaps a lucky shot from a handgun, flew through the smoke. It found the one man the city could not afford to lose. It struck Giovanni Giustiniani. The wound was mortal. The bullet had pierced Giustiniani's chest plate, smashing through the shoulder and lung. The pain was blinding. In a moment of delirious agony, the great captain, who had been the rock of the defense for 6 weeks, asked to be taken to his ship. Constantine begged him, "My brother, do not leave us. Your wound is slight. The danger is great. If you go, the city is lost." But the pain was too much. Giustiniani was carried through the streets to the harbor. As the Genoese soldiers saw their commander leaving the wall, their resolve shattered. They assumed the battle was lost. They abandoned their posts and ran for the ships. The line broke. The Janissaries, sensing the panic, redoubled their attack. A giant of a soldier named Hassan leaped onto the top of the stockade, hacking down defenders with his scimitar. He was cut down by arrows, but 10 more men took his place. The wave was now unstoppable. They poured over the debris, slaughtering the remaining Greeks who stood their ground. The Valley of Death had finally earned its name. Simultaneously, the disaster at the Carcaporta gate unfolded. Ottoman troops poured into the northern section of the city, flanking the defenders. The cry, "The city is taken," became a roar. The defense dissolved into a rout. Soldiers threw down their weapons and fled toward the harbor, hoping for a place on the Venetian or Genoese ships. The discipline that had held the walls for 53 days evaporated in 53 seconds. Constantine She stood near the gate of St. Romanus. He watched the collapse of his world. He saw his friends dying and his army fleeing. He had a choice. He could try to escape to the harbor, perhaps finding a ship to take him to Maria or Italy to live in exile as a king without a kingdom. But he was at Rome. He turned to his cousin, Theophilus, and his loyal friend, Don Francisco of Toledo. He reportedly cried out, "The city is fallen, and I am still alive," tearing off his imperial insignia so he could not be distinguished from a common soldier. The last emperor of the Romans drew his sword. With his handful of loyal companions, he charged directly into the oncoming flood of Janissaries. There was no strategy in this. It was a suicide of honor. He fought until he was overwhelmed. He was never seen again. His body was never positively identified. He simply vanished into the history of the city he died to defend. The walls were breached. The gates were smashed open. The Ottoman army flooded into the city like a river bursting a dam. The discipline of the siege was replaced by the chaos of the sack. Soldiers fanned out through the streets, killing anyone who resisted and capturing anyone who surrendered. The elderly and infirm were often killed on the spot. The young and strong were bound with ropes. The streets ran slippery with blood. The terror culminated at the Hagia Sophia. The great bronze doors were barred, and inside, thousands of citizens, men, women, children, priests, and nuns, huddled together. They were praying for the final miracle, the prophecy that an angel of the Lord would descend with a sword of fire to save them at the last moment. But the only angels that arrived were the Janissaries. With a crash that echoed through the vast dome, the doors were shattered. The soldiers rushed in. The looting began immediately. Icons were stripped of their silver frames. Tapestries were torn down. The worshippers were tied together in long chains, nuns with soldiers, merchants with beggars to be sold in the slave markets of Adrianople and Cairo. The sanctuary, which had been the heart of Orthodox Christendom for 1,000 years, was violated. At the harbor, a different tragedy played out. The captains of the Venetian and Genoese ships saw the city burning. They waited as long as they could, filling their decks with refugees who swam out to them. But the weight was sinking the vessels. Sailors had to beat back the desperate crowds with clubs to prevent the ships from capsizing. Finally, heavily laden with the sorrow of a lost nation, the small fleet cut their cables and sailed out into the Marmara, leaving thousands wailing on the shore. By the afternoon, the slaughter had largely ceased. The city was quiet, save for the moans of the captives and the crackle of fires. Sultan Mehmed II, now Fatih, the conqueror, waited until the chaos subsided before entering. He rode through the St. Romain's Gate. He passed the bodies of the defenders, unaware that the emperor lay among them. He rode slowly through the ruined streets of the city he had dreamed of since boyhood. He rode to the Hagia Sophia. Dismounting, he fell to his knees. He picked up a handful of dust from the floor and poured it over his turban, a gesture of humility, acknowledging that all glory belongs to God, and that even the greatest conqueror is but dust. He walked to the altar and ordered an imam to ascend the pulpit. The first call to prayer rang out, Allahu Akbar. The Cathedral of Justinian was now the Mosque of the Hagia Sophia. The transformation was instant. One world had ended, another had begun. The Roman Empire, the direct continuation of the state of Augustus and Caesar, was dead. The sun set on May 29, 1453. The Middle Ages were over. The scholars fleeing the city would carry their precious manuscripts to Italy, sparking the Renaissance. The trade routes to the east were blocked, forcing explorers like Columbus to look west, leading to the discovery of the Americas. The fall of this one city changed the trajectory of human history forever. But for the Greeks, the story did not end. A legend arose that Constantine XI did not die. That as the Turks surrounded him, an angel turned him into marble and hid him in a cave beneath the Golden Gate, where he sleeps, waiting for the day he will awaken and reclaim his city. It is a myth, of course, a comfort for a grieving people. But in the silence of history, the last emperor remains the eternal guardian of a lost dream. The light was gone. The night of Constantinople was over, and the modern world had begun.